Indeed, I will speak about Muhammad Asad as my central example. So I think it works to discuss this together, even though we
didn't plan this.
We didn't plan it, and I think also because we have different aspects to the same, let's say, example. And of course, yeah, my perspective on this, yeah, and the problem and the topic of conversion now comes from my study of literature, and I'm especially interested in the phenomenon of storytelling. I try on stories like clothes. This is a quotation. Through this comparison, the protagonist in Max Frisch's novel Gantenbein declares narration an existential and creative act, an act that not only circumscribes identities but effectually creates them. The I is narratively constructed, and this pertains not only to poets but to the whole of mankind. Consequently, in his essay, Our Lust for Stories, from 1960, which led the foundation of this novel, Frisch came to the following poignant conclusion. I quote, "Every person, not only poets, make up his own stories," unquote. As a matter of fact, the telling of stories is not only a literary and aesthetic process. It forms, generally speaking, the most elementary and simultaneously multi-layered existential, psychological, and anthropological and cultural act through which identities are created and asserted. Frisch, to quote him one last time, rather eloquently summarized this contention in the following passage taken from a lecture in New York in 1981. I quote, "I maintain, if you tell me nothing about your life, and if instead you do nothing but fantasize, and when I've heard 77 of your stories, sad ones, funny ones, inventions, the whole lot, you have revealed more of your real person than if you had told me your biography, be it ever so honest, unquote. The wide-ranging function of narration especially finds expression in the act of conversion. You know, this term, generally understood, circumscribes the fundamental personal transformation in the course of which a person embeds herself in a new system of orientation, be it religious, cultural, or political. And, as I hope to show now, narration plays an elementary role in the assertion of such a transformation. This is obvious in conversions that are explicitly described as such in Gospels, confessions, or autobiographies. But one is safe to say that in every act of conversion, no matter of what sort, narration proves to be of fundamental importance. Let me briefly summarize the function of narration with respect to conversion in the following 5 theses. So I come back to the former thesis.
I thought you were going to tell a story.
Wait and see. First thesis. First, the narrating of conversion is not only an accidental or purely descriptive process throughout the course of which the conversion turns into an object and is integrated into a biographical narrative. Rather, my first thesis argues, narration plays a constitutive, performative role in the act of conversion itself. Narration proves to be the agent underscoring the act of conversion, and in turn, conversion is the product and effect of narration. Therefore, narration not only describes the conversion, it also first and foremost constructs it. Consequently, conversion appears to be a narrative act. Thesis number 2. My second thesis argues that the constitutive function of narration is confirmed by the fact that the conversion narrative appears in a manner highly self-conscious. Herein, narration not only is a means to an end, it asserts itself as an end in itself. through its self-exposure. It exhibits itself in an even theatrical manner. Thus, the conversion narrative becomes a not a reflexive form of writing. It reflects and asserts itself in a mise en abîme of narration itself, as a story of a story. And we will come back to this formula, the story of a story. Number 3. The performative and reflexive conversion narrative is characterized by a specific temporality. According to my third thesis, the conversion narrative is reconstructive. It does so by way of reorganization of the past with respect to which is yet to come, and in the course of which the past is integrated into a secondary order of meaning, thus finding a new legitimation. Number 4. Conversion not only offer psychological case studies of identity transformation, rather they form complex social processes embedded within medial and cultural settings. It follows that conversion narratives carry an individual as well as a social aspect. On the one hand, they express the story of a transformation of one's identity with all subsequent crises, turning points, transitions, and new beginnings. On the other hand, they express the changing of social, cultural, political, and religious community belongings, though through acts of initiation and integration. It is especially this social and medial aspect of the conversion that is largely provided through narration. Furthermore, the socialization of these changing identities does not, as it may appear at first glance, constitute static and homogeneous identities. Rather, they present plural, dynamic, heterogeneous, and hybrid identity constructions. And the last thesis, number 5, the conversion narrative does not have to be defined solely on the ground of its functionality. It can also be defined formally. According to the 5th thesis, one can observe a sequence of specific narrative patterns virtually forming a dramatic structure. The basic narrative pattern of this structure is the result of a temporal and ideal difference between the time before and after the conversion. The overcoming of an old as well as the acceptance of a new identity in a new religious, cultural, or social system of orientation. This dramaturgy is best understood on the social level in the sense of exclusion and inclusion, and on the existential or psychological level in the sense of death and rebirth. Formally, this duality is further elaborated within a conversion narrative in a actually threefold manner. In a first step, the old identity and the old socio-cultural background, with its lack of meaning and value, its infatuation as well as its wrongness, are exposed. In a second step, the moment of transformation itself takes center stage, meaning the act of conversion, which can take the form of a sudden mystical experience, here comes in your spirituality, a rite de passage, or that of a slow and gradual process of transformation. The third step consists of an apologetic description of the newly acquired identity as well as the new surrounding, to which the positive quality of truth, being, freedom, nature, etc. are attributed. In what follows, I would like to further investigate these general observations of the conversion narrative. I shall do this with the help of a concrete example. As I just told, it's the conversion of the Galician Jew Leopold Weiss into Muhammad Asad. Muhammad Asad tells the story of his conversion in his autobiography, The Road to Mecca, which appeared in English in 1954 and shortly after in German in his own translation. It will provide us with the main source for the following observations. Now, I won't go into detail of this biography because I think some of you might know it. We can, if you have questions, we can discuss it later. But I will immediately go to the topic of narrating. In quite an obvious manner, Muhammad Asad, through the choice of his title, cites the pilgrimage, which every religious Muslim must undertake at least once during the course of his lifetime. The pilgrimage, which Asad himself had attended, serves as the teleological patron of his conversion. Already a brief glance at the basic structure of his content confirms us in our assumption that what we are dealing with here is a conversion narrative. It is the story of the transformation of a secular Polish Jew, Leopold Weiss, born in Lemberg in 1900, into a religious Muslim. The dramaturgy of the autobiography stages a twofold step: a leap away from the modern disorientation of Western Europe towards the genuineness and originality of the Orient, as well as the leap away from Western Judaism into Eastern Islam. So I skipped the whole biographical part. This conversion of a Galician Jew to Islam was unusual because, in general, most cases of Jewish conversion during modernity seem to follow two different patterns, namely that of assimilation and that of dissimulation. The pattern of assimilation, its goal being a Europeization, usually led to the acceptance of Christianity, not for religious reasons, but according to Heinrich Heine's famous figure of speech, in order to gain an access tickets to European culture, das Entreebillet zur europäischen Kultur, to become socially and culturally integrated. The pattern of dissimulation, on the other hand, following the Zionist narrative of a young Jewish or young Yiddish rebirth, led beyond the European diaspora and into a hyper-European Orient, which was conceived on the grounds of national belongings and not of religion. A prime example of which is to be found in Herzl's utopian novel Alt Neuland. Here, an assimilated Jewish Viennese intellectual, endowed with the typical pathological elements of the diaspora Jew, initially travels to Palestine seeking distraction, but then ends up supporting the new colonial project. The transformation of Leopold Weiss at first seems to have followed the same pattern. However, he subsequently begins to diverge from the assimilative as well as the Zionist pattern. The diaspora Jew tired of Europe does not turn into an integrated Christian, nor does he become an apocalyptic Zionist. On the contrary, he becomes an Oriental Muslim. In the above said, the narrative formation of this conversion has only been described from the outset. Let us now take a closer look to the form and function of narration itself. The characteristic performative and reflexive organization of the narrative is already observable in the title of the introductory chapter. There one reads, "The Story of a Story." This title conspicuously displays the fundamental role of narration in the conversion that is about to be described. Since it is not only the development of the autobiography which provides for a story of a story, but also the fact that the story of the conversion is itself narrated. Thus, from the very start, conversion does not only appear as the object, but also as the result of narration, which appears as the agent of conversion. In the chapter entitled "A Story of a Story," this is exemplified by way of a self-reflexive exposition of Asad's life as being the expression of a fundamental reorientation away from the Occident and towards the Orient. My story, thus the reader is addressed, and I quote, is the story of a European's discovery of Islam and of his integration within the Muslim community, unquote. From a meta perspective, the function of narration becomes even more pertinent. As a matter of fact, he not only narrates his conversion narrative intra-diegetically, he also presents the narration of his narrative extra-diegetically. Consequently, he introduces himself as the narrator of his story. And I quote, "Why don't you write your own autobiography? I'm sure it would make a fascinating reading," he was asked. Laughingly, I replied, "Well, I might perhaps let myself be persuaded to leave the Foreign Service and write such a book." Actually, he was working in the Foreign Service. "After all, writing is my original profession." He was a journalist. In the following week and month, my joking response lost the aspect of a joke. I began to think seriously about setting down the story of my life, and thus helping, in however small a measure, to lift the heavy wheel which separates Islam and its culture from the Occidental mind. My way to Islam had been, in many respects, unique. I had not become a Muslim because I had lived for a long time among Muslims. In the contrary, I decided to live among them because I had embraced Islam." Unquote. The uniqueness of this conversion narrative thus also brings the narrator to the fore, who initially tells his story who initially tells his story to his friends orally, and then later as a writer goes on jotting it down on paper. That in such a manner he is not only recounting the story, but again the story of the story. It is exemplified in his introduction, asserting emphatically, and I quote, "And here it is, the story of all my life," unquote. In the main text that follows the introductory chapter, the self-reference is evident in a recurring theme which is of elementary importance, namely the story of the conversion is told to one or a few of his Arab friends who repeatedly urge him to tell the story. A prime example of such a self-staging is apparent in a scene located in an old library in Medina, where the old Shaykh Abdallah Bulyahid, after having talked about the decadence of the Occident, raised the following question, and I quote, "What is the realization of what the Dajjal means that made thee embrace Islam, O my son?" Sorry, I quoted a little bit wrong. "Was it the realization of what the Dajjal means that made thee embrace Islam, O my son?" The answer, "In a way, I think it must have been, but it was only the last step." "The last step? Yes. Thou hast told me once the story of thy way to Islam, but when and how exactly did it first dawn upon thee that Islam might be thy goal?" Unquote. So, through narration, an occasion to tell the story of the conversion is created, thus providing an opportunity to repeatedly replay this narrative act. The example shows that, in a double sense, narration partakes in the act of conversion. In the sense of an autobiographical self-construction and in the sense of a social act of integration. Both senses are achieved through narration. Another example provides us with further evidence. The last step of the conversion, provoked by a prophesying lecture of the Quran and stripping him of his last remaining doubts, also consists of a narrative act, in whose center stands the confession to faith. This, as well, is staged within the narrative and consequently told as a story of a story. Again, Abdallah ibn Bulyahid is the interlocutor. I quote, and then what didst thou do then? The obvious thing, O Shaykh, I thought out a Muslim friend of mine, an Indian who was at the time head of the small Muslim community in Berlin, and told him that I wanted to embrace Islam. He stretched out his right hand toward me, and I placed mine in it, and in the presence of two witnesses declared, I be witness that there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is his messenger, unquote. In this mirrored narrative scene, testimony plays an important role. It forms an essential element, initially in the oral and then in the written narrative setting. The role of the witness is applied on different diegetic levels. Both witnesses of the intra-diegetic initiation rite correspond on the extra-diegetic level with that of the Shaykh, to whom the story is told orally within the narrative. And lastly, on the meta-diegetic level, it is the current reader functioning as a witness to whom his story of the story is presented in written form. The logic of the conversion corresponds to a continuous narrative misonabim. What is being narrated is the telling of a story as well as the narration of this telling of a story. This consciously chosen, virtually, literally composed and theatrically staged artistry by which the act of conversion is narrated is abundant throughout the whole of Assad's autobiography. Repeatedly and on different diegetic levels, it plays with the telling of the conversion narrative. A further example is provided by the narrative experimentation of his own conversion with that of others. That's the comparison. This misonabbing experimentally transposes one's own conversion onto that of another, lying within familiar closeness in that case. It is the story, as Assad puts it, of a great uncle of mine who had, in the most unusual way, now I quote, betrayed the family tradition and even turned away from the religion of his forefathers, unquote. Obviously, as a sort of a literary experimentation, laying the ground for his own conversion narrative, Assad embeds his own story within that of his uncle. One could even speak of it in terms of psychoanalysis and thus understand it in the sense of a transposition by which a relief from one's own burden is achieved. However, this familiar example follows the classical pattern pertaining to Jewish conversion narratives of the 19th century, the Jewish Christian conversion narrative. Speaking of that almost mythical great-great-uncle was subject to a great taboo in the Lemberg-Weiss family, forbidden but nonetheless attractive. It was the story of an apostate in whom the family originally laid great expectations. He was to become a rabbi, yet he sold first in Leipzig in order to gain an extra income. As it turns out, this was to have fatal consequences. And I quote the story. In Leipzig, he sold his furs as usual, but instead of returning to his hometown as usual, he sold the cart and the horse as well, shaved off his beard and sidelocks, and forgetting his unsolved wife, his unloved wife, went to England, from where he emerged after a few years as a promising scholar and a convert to Christianity. Shortly after sending a letter of divorce to his Jewish wife, he married a girl from among the Gentiles. Not much was known to our family about his later life, except that he achieved considerable distinction as an astronomer and university teacher and ended his day as a knight, unquote. From the perspective of liberal Judaism, this would have been an example of a successful career. However, in the Lambert family, this sort of conversion could only be despised. It was a horrifying example. This negative narrative follows a dissuasive pattern of 19th century Jewish literature. It is the horrific vision of the renegade, the apostate, appearing, for example, in Leo Herzberg Frankel's story, The Meshumet, like other stories like this. Leopold Weiss, of course, is not telling the apostasy of his great uncle as a warning. Rather, he cites this position as being that of the family. Assad does so in order to shed critical light on his family's views and to then posit his own account of conversion against theirs. To him, far from being an act of treason, the story of his great uncle rather represents a successful attempt to break free from his family ties. Therefore, it lays the ground for his own conversion narrative, even though, as we have seen, its goal is not the secular modern Christendom of his uncle, but on the contrary, religious Islam. Now, the rest of my paper I kind of summarize orally. Don't read it. In the course of this text, you can find many other examples where he mirrors his own conversion in small stories, in larger stories, in dreams, and in presentiments or presciences. Didn't know this word. Not presentiments, presciences. That's one story. So there are a lot of micro stories, and this makes the text really artificial and highly literary. And I could give you a lot of examples, and the metro example is of course another one where this is also kind of a presentiment or prescience of what comes now. That's one thing. So the story is retold in many ways. But the last aspect I want to highlight, this is that that it's not only the question of this one conversion, the personal conversion that he's telling a master narrative. And with this master narrative, I want to conclude. In the end, Muhammad Asad's conversion expresses a complex interviewing structure of subjective autobiographical narratives, whence, step by step, Muhammad Asad is seen to emerge from Leopold Weiss. Furthermore, the conversion is legitimated through its connection to a grand civilizational context, forming the actual master narrative of the singular conversion narrative. The subjective transformation that all the personal to personal conversion does not remain isolated and contingent. Rather, it is embedded within the larger context of a grand epochal and civilizational transformation in which the conversion is seen to participate, thus taking on a virtually global level of meaning. Within the scope of Muhammad Asad's autobiography, this world historical dimension of this conversion is not only coincidentally staged through the use of citation. A controversial contemporary master narrative is cited, referring to the destruction of Europe, as well as the Austro-Hungarian Empire during the course of the First World War, namely Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West. This is a pessimistic cultural interpretation of the decaying Occident. From the onset of Muhammad Asad's conversion narrative, the goal was, I quote, to exchange one world for another, unquote. However, the expression of a personal crisis of identity and meaning, in the worst case leading to nihilism, is simultaneously the expression of a crisis of the Occident as such, like it is presented in Spengler's pessimistic account of modernity. As a matter of fact, the opposition between the decaying Occident and the rising Orient takes up Spengler's typological opposition between the Faustian Occident and the magical Orient. First and foremost, it is Spengler's much repeated negative description of the Occident in decay which finds recurrence in Asad's writing. Muhammad Asad turns them into apocalyptic scenarios resulting from what he calls the, I quote, materialistic gospel of the Western way of life, unquote. However, in his description of the declining West, he goes way beyond Spengler using instead terms derived from the Quran. I quote, the world of the, I don't know if I pronounce this right, the Pharanges has become the world of Dajjal, the glittering, the deceptive one, unquote. It was a world, he goes on saying, I quote, in upheaval and convulsion, that was our Western world. Bloodshed, destruction, violence, on and an unpredicted scale, on an unpredicted scale. The breakdown of so many social conventions, a clash of ideologies, an embittered all-round fight for new ways of life. These were the signs of our time, unquote. And while the cultural pessimist Spengler saw a new Caesarism emerging from the ruins of decaying Occident, Muhammad Asad located the rebirth of civilization within the magical Orient, which he understood as the origin and final destination of any true civilization. Muhammad Asad thus embeds his individual conversion narrative within this epochal and civilizational change. In this manner, the micro-narrative circumscribing his personal conversion merges into a larger macro-narrative, the grand narrative of the declining Occident and the rising Orient. Thank you.